Okay, so let's get the afternoon session started. So I hope you have a nice lunch. Okay, so I'm gonna start the afternoon session with Professor Jelena Notaros, who's gonna talk about silicon photonics for AR display and beyond. So holographic AR display. So let's welcome Professor Notaros.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to see everyone. As mentioned, my name is Jelena Notaros. I'm assistant, or I guess associate as of just recently, professor here in the in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. And I'm really excited to introduce you to the work being done by our group in silicon photonics, and specifically with a focus on holographic augmented reality displays. So before we begin, let's see a show of hands. Who here is actually familiar with silicon photonics? Okay, good. Number of hands up. I see some students in the back of the room that took the silicon photonics class. I hope you guys raised your hands. But before we start, let's actually start with an intro to silicon photonics before we get into how we can use silicon photonics for holographic AR displays. So here on the bottom, you can see a cross-sectional view of a silicon photonics platform that we've developed in the past. And what you'll see is that we're trying to repurpose CMOS electronics processes for photonics. So on the left-hand side, we have a CMOS bulk transistor. We have the silicon, the doped silicon, metal coming down into contact with that doped silicon to enable electronic switching. We can reuse these same layers to create our photonic devices on chip. So here in the center, we have our silicon dielectric waveguide. It's going to look like a long rectangle on our chip that's guiding the light down the chip. We can then take that waveguide, extend it on either side, dope the sides of it, or place other modulating materials to allow us to modulate the light that's in that waveguide by having these electrodes coming down and actually applying electrical signals across our waveguide for modulation of the light in our waveguide. Then maybe we want to create nano antennas that are going to emit the light up and off the chip. We call these grating couplers. That's what's going to allow us to interact with the surroundings of the chip. Now, when we create these silicon photonics platforms, we can take optical devices and systems that were once large and bulky. Maybe we had optical systems that were spanning an entire optics table with bulk optical lenses or optical fibers. We can take all those components, integrate them down into our completely flat millimeter scale silicon photonic chips. We can now fabricate these silicon photonic chips at the wafer scale. So on the top here, you can see a photograph of a 12-inch wafer that we had fabricated for our group. And by taking advantage of these wafer scale fabrication processes, we now have a scalable way to fabricate photonic devices. And maybe even more importantly, we have a scalable in terms of the number of devices that we actually can integrate together. So we have a way to fabricate these devices at large scale with a lot of integrity of the device. You can have a very tight process tolerance. Also, by integrating these devices into this silicon photonics form factor, we can have new functionalities that were never before possible with bulk optics or fiber optics. And that's really, I think, the most exciting part. We can enable new systems for optics that were never before possible with bulk optics or fiber optics. So in general, our group, the Photonics and Electronics Research Group, or PERG, works on silicon photonics. We collaborate with different foundries around the US and the world to enable new silicon photonics platforms. We use these platforms to enable new silicon photonic devices and then integrate them up into large-scale silicon photonic systems for many different applications: LiDAR systems, trap-down quantum systems, biophotonics, 3D printing, and then the thing that we'll really focus on for today's talk, which is our holographic AR displays. So let's jump into the motivation for these holographic AR displays and our current work in this space. So we've already talked about this a couple of times, but I'll still talk you through the limitations of current AR displays as we see them. You know, this is a type of AR display you'd see. Usually the information and kind of what's been really discussed here today is this idea of having a display where you have a micro display that sits on the side of the head. you have some optics, or some combining elements that take that information, the amplitude information generated by that microdisplay, and then project it into the world in front of the user. So that leads to kind of a large, heavy, indiscrete solution for AR displays. Maybe for consumer use, this is all right. But especially when we talk to our colleagues in the Department of Defense, they're very interested in having a very discrete AR display that could be integrated in a normal pair of eyeglasses without any extra components on the side of the head to make a very discrete solution. Also, when we talk to friends in the Air Force, they are very interested in reducing the weight of the optics that's currently required there. They say that the extra weight on the side of the head for an Air Force pilot when they're in the high G environment causes strains in the pilot's necks when they're wearing these AR displays, and a lot of them need surgery after they leave the service because of this extra weight. Also, and this has been talked about again earlier today, but usually when you look through these displays, you have a limited field of view. I know lots of nice advancements currently coming out of Meta where we're increasing the field of view, but we really want to see the whole near peripheral field of view of the human eye, increase of the field of view even further. And also, like was talked about earlier today, there's a low luminance of current displays where we take them out on a bright sunny day, that information is pretty washed out. And then this is the real big limitation that I think we need to solve, is the fact that these current AR displays, based on the optics that are used to generate that information, they're limited to displaying information on a single focal plane. So for example, if I was projecting information about Chris, he's sitting here in the fourth row, right? My eye would constantly have to focus from Chris to the display plane, back to Chris, back to the display plane, back to Chris. And that refocusing of your eye, that's done with the tiny little muscles in your eye. And if your eye is constantly having to do this refocusing throughout the day, that's going to cause eye strain or headaches for most people. It's called the vergence accommodation conflict, and it really limits long-term usage of these current AR displays. So we need a solution that's going to be a truly holographic, small form factor solution for AR. And that's what we're really working on here in our group. We're using this idea of silicon photonics to create a transparent chip that sits directly in front of your eye. It would just be a piece of glass to do the entire display functionality that could be integrated in a pair of eyeglasses. And it's actually fully encoding a holographic phase front out of that silicon photonics system to display information in the entire 3D realm to resolve that vergence accommodation conflict and enable long-term usage of these displays. So now let me talk you through how this system looks. One of the major components in there is what we call an integrated optical phased array. So if you think back to maybe your electromagnetics class, there is this, if you took maybe advanced electromagnetics class, there is a system called an RF phased antenna array. And the optical phased array borrows heavily from that idea. So we would have an array of antennas here. In the RF domain, these would be RF antennas. For our system, these are actual optical antennas over here. And we control the phase and amplitude of the light emitted out of each of these antennas. And that's going to allow us to shape the emission profile out of the array itself. Of course, these antennas all have to be fed coherently from a single source to be able to shape that emission profile. And the real advantage here of using silicon photonics is that now we can show this optical phased array concept with tens of thousands of little optical antennas on our silicon photonic chips with all those distribution networks actually on the same chip. So this allows us to have a very small form factor, high-speed, non-mechanical way of steering optical beams around. Now, of course, we can't talk about this idea of an optical phased array without giving a shout out to the other colleagues in the field who have worked on this space. We're seeing a lot of work, excellent work throughout the world, especially over the last 10 or so years. But if you take a look at these current demonstrations, almost all of them have really been focused on infrared beam emission and just scanning beams, forming and scanning beams in the far field out of these optical phased arrays. So what do we need to do to actually make a holographic display out of this technology is first bring this technology down to the visible light regime and then actually enable it to emit holographic beams. So let me give you an idea of what this looks like. We call the system VIPER, which stands for Visible Integrated Photonics for Enhanced Reality. And one of the core building blocks here is one of these optical phased arrays, but now operating at the visible wavelength regime. We have here the input to this optical phased array. We have these little taps off, waveguide taps off, that go to these grating-based antennas that emit the light off of the chip. We encode the phase out of these antennas using integrated liquor crystal modulators, where we have the waveguide on the chip and liquor crystal actually integrated with these silicon photonic waveguides to enable very compact visible light integrated modulators. This is the pixel in our VIPER display. One of these optical phased arrays is acting as the pixel. We then take that optical phased array and we tile it up into a two-dimensional grid. So each of these little pixels is an individual optical phased array. We can then encode the amplitude and phase fronts in a distributed manner across this entire array to actually encode that holographic virtual image out of the display plane. And again, how do you encode holographic information? You need to have precise control, spatially encoded control of the phase and amplitude at all points in a coherent aperture. So in this way, we can control the phase and amplitude across this entire aperture. So I hope that gives you a feel for what this technology is. So now let's very quickly, I know we don't have too much time, so we'll very quickly go through some of our recent results in this space. So first, this whole idea is that you'd have a chip that sits in front of your eye that you're looking through. And if you take a standard silicon photonic chip, you put it in front of your eye, you can't see through that. And the reason why is because silicon photonics are normally based on wafers that have a silicon handle on them. And silicon absorbs visible wavelengths. So we had to work in collaboration with SUNY Poly, that's the organization that houses AIM Photonics, to develop the first 300 millimeter silicon photonics platform based on transparent wafers. So here you can see my student, Milica. She's actually holding up one of those 300 millimeter wafers. I promise she's not just holding her hands there. There actually is a wafer there. We then take that wafer and we segment it up into little chiplets, and we developed the passive version of this holographic VIPER display. This chip, if you actually went to our lab, and I think some of you guys are going to come to our lab tomorrow, this chip, if we had it powered on, you could look through it, and this is actually a system of 1,000 little optical phased arrays with about 10 antennas per an optical phased array, so a pretty complex system. And all those antennas are working together to generate a holographic cube floating about a meter in front of you in space. So this is a true holographic image being projected by this display. You, as the viewer, would look through that chip, and you'd see the hologram floating out there. Everyone around you wouldn't actually be able to see any information. The display is actually emulating the holographic face fronts and projecting them towards your eye. Now, this is super cool, right? We're creating this cube that we can see coming out of our chip. But of course, we don't want to see a cube forever. We want to create an active holographic display. So the challenge there is that there's been very little work in creating active visible light modulators on chip that are very compact. And the reason why is that we need to move to materials that waveguide visible light well, or in other words, silicon nitride. And silicon nitride has a very low thermo-optic coefficient, effectively no electro-optic properties. So usually integrated visible light modulators are very long. So to get around that challenge, we worked on integrating a liquor crystal material on top of our silicon nitride waveguides. This allows you to have a very compact visible light modulator on chip, actually 2 orders of magnitude more compact compared to what you would normally get with thermo-optic silicon nitride modulators for visible light. This is the first demonstration of visible light integrated liquor crystal-based modulators led by my student Milica with help from Andres, who's actually sitting in the back over there, actually wearing his Perg polo, the red one. We then take this idea of the liquor crystal modulator and we integrate it into a different configuration to enable equally compact amplitude modulators on chip. This guy is only 9 microns long to get switching on and off. We then have to make sure that the light that's actually emitted from our displays is only projecting towards the user and not out into the environment. So to enable that, we need unidirectionally emitting antennas. So this is the first demonstration of integrated visible light unidirectional antennas for optical phased arrays, work led by Andres with help from Milica. Then we integrate all these components together to show the actual visible light optical phase array. This is the first demonstration of actively tunable visible light integrated optical phase array, where we have a chip sitting down here, and then it's scanning the beam around. Our initial results were all done at red wavelengths, and then more recently, this is work led by Henry, also sitting in the back, we were actually able to show a spectrum spanning integrated optical phase array for the first time, where we have red, green, and blue light simultaneously emitting from the chip and being able to be steered around. And then finally, we're working to integrate all those components together into that active holographic display. This is really work that we have ongoing, so be super excited if any of you want to collaborate on this. We're essentially taking this passive version of the holographic display and starting to integrate all those liquid crystal components. We showed an initial demonstration of that with some components integrated together for the active modulation. Now we're working towards making a large-scale version of this holographic display. I think a very important part of that is actually integrating the electronics with the photonics. So we're also working on a thin film transistor backplane solution with Kopin Corporation to do that integration as well. So I hope that gives you a feel for where our holographic display effort is going. And with the last couple minutes, I thought it would be interesting to introduce you very briefly to some of the other efforts in our group outside of AR displays. First, we're working on using these optical phase arrays to emit light off the chip, steer it around, and then have the light reflected back and received by the chip to enable solid-state LiDAR sensors. We're also working on using these holographic emitters to create a chip that can sit in the palm of your hand to project holographic light into a vat of resin to cure objects, to enable a portable chip-based solution for 3D printers. It's the first demonstration of a chip that can actually do 3D printing, which we're excited about. This is work led by Sabrina, who's also in the back with the help from Milica and Tal. We're also enabling chips that emit these holographic light fields to interface with trapped ions for a scalable way and stable way to emit light to do qubit operations for trapped ion quantum systems. Again, work led by Sabrina with help from Ashton, Tal, and Milica in collaboration with MIT Lincoln Lab. We're also making these chips to focus light to trap biological particles. In this case, we were using cancer cells, and to trap and manipulate those cells, for the first time showing cell manipulation using an integrated single beam optical tweezer. To enable these biophotonics applications, and I think that this is also interested if we're thinking about curved displays. We actually worked on demonstrating the first 300 millimeter wafers that are flexible in collaboration with SUNY AIM Photonics, where we have this wafer transferred to a flexible substrate. And then also we're using these chips to do underwater optical communications with data streams of about 1 gigabit per second. So having these chips doing beam steering in the water, emitting these visible wavelengths. So I hope that gives you a feel for the other type of work that we're doing in our group. So overall, I introduced you to the field of silicon photonics. We talked about holographic AR displays, the motivation, especially for the holographic aspect, and some of our current work in this space. And then very quickly talked you through some of our other efforts in this field of silicon photonics. Of course, I can never give a talk without giving a huge shout out to all the wonderful students that are working on our team. Many of them are in the back there. Feel free to come up to me afterwards, and I'll be happy to introduce you to them. We'll especially call out Andres, Milica, and Henry, who are really working quite a bit on the AR display technology. I'll also mention our collaborators, both at MIT and many institutions around the US. Especially in this case, we'll call out SUNY Poly, that houses Albany for all the wafer fabrication work. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll be super happy to take any questions.
Thank you. For the visible work, so what's going to limit the size or the resolution that you can achieve? Is it the downscaling the liquid crystal modulator, or is it actually the wafer patterning and transporting the light around?
That's a great question. So let me maybe switch back to this concept slide. It's because I think that that's actually motivates essentially this architecture. So when we talk about resolution for holographic display, it's a little bit different than when we normally think about a display and resolution. So normally when we have some kind of just aperture that we're looking at, we look at resolution and how you can encode essentially the amplitude everywhere in space. So essentially the physical resolution of the display is actually the resolution of the image that you're viewing. With the holographic architecture, it's actually different. So if you have some physical display aperture, that aperture can be used essentially to focus light to one point. And then the resolution would essentially be the size of that aperture focused down to wherever you're actually trying to create that point. So if you're trying to create the point closer to the eye, we've actually demonstrated resolutions down to less than 5 microns. I think we actually even showed 1 micron resolution. If you're emitting further from the eye, just the Rayleigh limit is going to limit that resolution to be larger. Then if you think, okay, I have this display, I'm projecting coherent information, now I want to create 2 points, right? Essentially what you can think of is that that display aperture, half of it is going to, how can we call it, like half of that Fourier plane is going to be used to create 1 point, half of it is going to be used to create the other point. So even if you're focusing that light, creating a holographic image on the same plane, now the resolution is actually increased, or sorry, the resolution gets a little bit worse if you create more information. So the exact comparison in terms of resolution is a little bit tricky. However, what I can mention is if we take a look at this spatial domain, actually what we're encoding here, the size of those pixels is going to be limited based on how small can we make those modulators to get our 2 pi phase shift. And that's actually the reason why we go to an optical phase array-based architecture, because as many of you guys, if you're working on holographic information encoding know, it's very hard to enable small, compact phase modulation. So you end up getting higher order effects that occur, which are called grading lobes. So if we can essentially encode more information by having these more complex architectures, we can get rid of some of that. But yeah, right now our current liquid crystal modulators, they're about 10 to 15 microns large. That's essentially limiting the size of these optical phase array pixels. But again, it's a little bit hard to make the exact one-to-one comparison in what you would normally think of as a pixel, because you're essentially encoding more information out of your pixel because you have this phased array architecture. Yeah, hope that helps.